Welcome to my monthly wrap-up for March. Hey guys, welcome back to All Booked Up. My name's Adrian, and this is going to be my wrap-up for the month of March 2021. Overall, this month has been a pretty good reading month for me. There will be a page of stats in front of you right now showing you some of the things about my month. Generally, it's been well rated. I've enjoyed the books I've read generally, and I've got to a decent amount, although a lot of them have actually been relatively short. So these numbers may seem a little bit inflated because there's quite a few short things on here, which I've enjoyed, as you can see by the two novellas. There's also a novel in here which is only 250 pages, so there are a few short ones which are kind of padding my stats, if you will. So let's start this wrap up. We're going to go in my rating order, so we're going to start with my least favourites of the month, and then we're going to get all the way to my favourites of the month. Thankfully, there are quite a few of those. So actually, this is the first book I read this month, as well as one of my lowest rated, unfortunately. It is called This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Mokhtar and Max Gladstone. This is a novella, it is a short book, and it is a sci-fi romance. It is written in the form of letters from one time agent to another time agent that works for a different agency. They're kind of at odds, and it's letters from one to the other as they have a budding romance as they essentially work cases all throughout the timeline. It is a book that I wanted to love. It is beautifully written. The prose is very lyrical and really nice. It was really nice to read. It never felt difficult. It was never clunky. It was just really lyrical and beautiful, and that was one of the big draws for this novella in my eyes. On the other hand, it was the prose that pulled me through this novella far more than it was the characters or the plot or anything that was actually going on. It was a little bit like reading a writing exercise where two writers are trying to outdo each other with how wonderfully they can express themselves. And they did express themselves really well. It is beautiful and well written, but it is not a story that I actually love, unfortunately. Any emotion it prompted and it elicited in me was basically because one of the characters told me to in the letter. There was very little that really impacted me in how they engaged, other than a character saying how they felt. It was very much tell, not show, and that's partially down to the style and the format chosen, but that did in some ways make this fall a little bit flat for me. If you really want to read some brilliant lyrical prose, this is something you should get into. If you like the sound of this romance via letters with a slight sci-fi time-bending twist, pick it up. But for me, unfortunately, it didn't quite hit the mark. Now, my other 3-star read for this month is the other sci-fi I read this month, unfortunately, and this was Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. This is book 2 of the Red Rising saga. I think maybe I wasn't in the right frame of mind for this book. I really enjoyed the discussions I had with people as we were reading it together as a group. I really found that really interesting. The concept, if you'd explained to me the plot of this book and what happened, I think I'd have really loved it, loved the sound of it. Some of the twists and reveals, brilliant, like absolutely wonderful. I think my main issue was it just felt a little bit meandering. So the plot seemed to lack direction, and I think that was intentional, but it did make it a little bit of a slog for me to push through some parts of it. If I pulled out just some of there are probably 5 or 6 brilliant scenes that if you look at those scenes specifically, you'd say this book is brilliant. It was kind of how they were all stitched together and how they flowed together that caused the issues, because there was lots of meandering, and maybe if I'd been in the right frame of mind, I wouldn't have minded that, but I did struggle with it slightly. A 3-star for me is still, this is a decent book. It was fine, I enjoyed reading it. So 3 stars is by no means, this is a bad book. It's just, I didn't really, like, I'm not going to be preaching about this book to everyone I know, yeah? This is a good book that I enjoyed reading and it was fine. And I think that actually, moving on to reading the 3rd book in the series, Morning Star, next month, I'm hoping that that's really going to elevate this series for me. We are now on to 4-star reads for this month. Let's go straight to the 2nd novella I read this month. I in fact just finished it a couple of hours ago as of recording. And this is Breach of Peace by Daniel Green. This for me is a 4-star read. I think as a debut author, he's done very well. It is a novella, and as such, it has a lot of limitations. So the time we have to spend with characters means that we don't necessarily get the character development we'd want. I think part of that's down to the writing as well. I don't think that that Green absolutely nails his character work and how he shows us what his characters are like, unfortunately. But I think the atmosphere and the tone that this is written in is really good. It gives us a real feel for the world. It feels very visceral in places. It really made me feel like I was physically there. I felt the horror elements that were worked in really well. That's a real positive for this book, I think. I think as far as a novella goes, it was pretty well realised. Some of the elements that were lacking, it was hard to tell whether it was down to the writing or down to the format. So whether that be the character work and character development lacking a little, or whether it be the plot being a little bit simple, I don't know if that was because of the novella or because we've got a new author. But I would say the character premise, the premise of the world and how we are shown that world and the tone and atmosphere we're given is done really, really well. So there are some negatives here, but there are some real big positives as well. And that came in as a 4-star read for me. It's going to be hard for a novella to really push 5 stars for me anyway. But I thought this was a really solid first entry, and I think it shows a lot of potential. The second 4-star read for me is Warlock Holmes, A Study in Brimstone. This is by G.S. Denning. As you can probably tell, this is quite a simple premise. It's taking the classic Sherlock Holmes stories and it is putting a fantastical twist on them, and it is making Sherlock into a warlock. So he has arcane powers. We're still following Dr. John Watson, and the world has a very humorous, fantastical look to it. This is very much a comedy, and this is very much satire, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was, for what it was, it made me chuckle. I do have ingrained nostalgia for Sherlock Holmes stories. I do have a love of that kind of urban gaslamp fantasy. So yeah, it was probably always going to work for me. But I think Denning did really well in bringing that to life. It is impressively close in plot to the Sherlock Holmes stories that it's based on. So the first part of this is based on A Study in Pink. There should be a dedicated review coming on my channel either this week or next week. So do keep your eyes out for that, where you'll get some of my fuller thoughts on this book. The next 4-star read for me was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I'll give you a brief rundown, but if you want to know more of my thoughts, go and have a look at my dedicated review that I'll link below in the doobly-doo. This was a book I wanted to love. The premise really got me, and the first quarter or so of this book hooked me completely. What I will say is I don't think Schwab completely nailed it, and that's what sort of kept it from being a 5-star book for me. Like I said, if you want to know fuller thoughts, go have a look at my dedicated review for this one. My final 4-star book that I read this month is an author that I've read a lot of books by, who I absolutely adore, but this is the first book of his in the YA category that I've actually read. It is by Brandon Sanderson, and it is The Rhythmatist. Now, I have read every Cosmere work written by Sanderson. He is one of my favourite authors. The Cosmere is one of my favourite series of all time, but this is my first have a look at his young adult stuff. I've not read any of the Skyward series, I've not read any of the Reckoners, this was my first go. So this book follows Joel, who is at a school that is partially a normal school and has a magical campus as well, or a magical section on the same campus, I should say. He doesn't have any magical powers, but he really, really longs to. Now this features the classic hard magic system you'd expect from a Sanderson book, and I think we follow Joel in such a way that we really feel his want to be involved with that, how he longs to be a part of that scene, but he does not have the ability. And I think that's a really interesting take on this kind of genre. Often we see the character who at the very start has no magic, and then sort of the inciting incident is you've got magic. Whereas this is very much not the case here. We follow Joel as he is struggling with his identity as someone who doesn't have the ability to use this magic. And I think that's really interesting. It's interesting as well, the world that Sanderson is building. It very much feels like an alternate history Earth. It's a little bit steampunk. It's got sort of the clockwork technology vibe to it. It also has a lot of place names that you'd sort of recognise, but with slightly odd twists on the cultures. So it was really an interesting place to start my Sanderson young adult journey. But I think it was a very good, solid young adult book. As you'd come to expect, the end of this, sort of the climax of this book was brilliant. I did absolutely love it. And it makes me a little bit sad that this was written such a long time ago and there were no follow-ups to it. I would really like a follow-up to this book. I think that would be really good. But obviously I know Sanderson is wanting to really focus on getting his Cosmo work sorted and getting as much of that out as possible. And hey, I'm not going to complain. I love the Cosmo. Now we're going to get on to 5-star reads for the month of March. So I've got a few 5-star reads, thankfully, and some of these books are some of my favourite books of all time. So in that sense, I've had a really good reading month. So first up, let's talk about The Long Price Quartet. You may well have seen my Should I Read The Long Price Quartet video, which I know Alan over at the Library of Alexandria shared as well. So thanks if you had a look. If you haven't, go check that out to get some of my thoughts on whether you would like this series or not, whether you should read it, whether it might be for you. What I will say is, it is definitely for me. This series is brilliant. I read the first 2 books back in February, and then I picked up book 3, which is An Autumn War, and book 4, which is The Price of Spring. I picked both of those up this month in March. They were some of the first books I read this month, in fact. I'm obviously not going to spoil anything to do with the early part of the series, so this is going to be very brief thoughts. I would say that I think book 3 is, so An Autumn War, is the best book in this series. I think it does a good job of shifting some of our thoughts and opinions on books 1 and 2. I think it is just a wonderful slight change of pace to books 1 and 2, and a change of perspective, and I think that's done really well. And then book 4, The Price of Spring, changes the perspective again, but more so by narrowing it. Now, there are a lot of characters we've seen from their point of view of so far in the series, and then in The Price of Spring, Daniel Abraham really narrows it down. He narrows down our viewpoints, and I find that really interesting. The fact that we've been with these characters for 50-odd years is amazing, and it is written in a way where we can really feel how they have evolved, how life events have changed them, how trauma and issues that have happened in these earlier books now reflect in the way these characters act, the way they behave, and I think that's amazing. With these 2 5-star reads, this has solidified itself as one of my favourite series of all time, and I'm now really looking to work out where I can fit in Daniel Abraham's other fantasy series, The Dagger and the Coin. I might not get to it until maybe June, July time, but I really, really, really want to get to that, because I think if it's anywhere near this level, I'm going to really enjoy it. My next 5-star book was The Bloody Rose by Nicholas Eames. This is book 2 in the Banned series. Again, you may have seen the review up on my channel for Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose. I read Kings of the Wild in January and I absolutely loved it. It was a 5-star read for me. I picked up Bloody Rose this month. I enjoyed it, maybe not quite as much as Kings of the Wild. I did still really enjoy it. It's still a 5-star read for me. It is interesting. I was just talking about Daniel Abraham and the Long Price Quartet and how he shifted perspective as we got further through the series. I think Nicholas Eames does well here in he changes up his formula. So Kings of the Wild was very highly comedic, was really fun and a sort of, classic road trip movie almost. In a fantasy setting. Whereas Bloody Rose does take this world a little bit more seriously, and that's because we've changed the perspective of who we're following. We are following a different band about half a decade later. And it does feel like there is more serious, well, it's not even a more serious subject matter necessarily. What is happening in the world is just as serious as in Kings of the Wild. But actually, the characters we are following take it much more seriously, and that puts a different spin on this. I was expecting the fun, rollicking romp that we got in Kings of the Wild. Actually, in Bloody Rose, it is much more heartfelt, a little bit more serious. There are some really amazingly explored themes, whether that be parenthood or identity, even addiction. Some of these things are handled really well, and I really enjoyed Bloody Rose. It probably doesn't top Kings of the Wild for me, but it is an easy 5 stars. I really enjoyed this. And if either of these sound interesting to you, go have a look at my review and pick up Kings of the Wild. Seriously, do it. I think you may not love it. I know it's not for everyone, but I absolutely adored it. And I really enjoyed Bloody Rose as well. And we have got there my final book of the month. This is my last 5-star read, and this is by Susanna Clarke. This is Piranesi. Now, me and Susanna Clarke have a bit of a fraught history, shall we say. I heard so many wonderful things about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I picked this book up last year, and I just didn't like it particularly. It felt very long and meandering. I know people say it's a masterpiece, and to be honest, I am looking to pick it up again. I feel like Klaus may hurt me. Books by Klaus, he'll be in the doobly as well. I think he might hurt me for my opinion on Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but it's a very different story for Piranesi. I absolutely love this story. For those of you who don't know, it's very short, it's about 250 pages. I'm not going to tell you too much about it at all because I think it is so much better if you go in blind. So all I will say is we are following a man whose world is essentially a house. It is a huge sort of classical sort of house full of halls and vestibules, full of statues, almost like Romanesque statues. And there are tides of water that flow through the house at different periods. And that's all I'm going to tell you, basically. That's sort of the setting we get given, and that's all I want to tell you. It is very short. It is really well written. It is in a sort of epistolary format, so it is reading this main character's journal, and it is it's just full of mystery. We get to take what he says and piece them together. It does a good job of only showing us what he would see and telling us things in a way that he would tell it to his journal. It doesn't ever break that fourth wall. It doesn't ever give us a top-down view. It just follows this character and his journal entries. And I think it is wonderful, and you should read it, basically. So that's my 5-star read for Piranesi. That's my final 5-star read for the month. So there we go, 10 books. I enjoyed many of these a lot. There's a couple of these that are going to be on my favourite books or favourite series of all time list. So yeah, it's been a really, really good reading month for me. Great, like this video if you liked it. If you want to subscribe, click that button, and I'll see you again next time.